Welcome everybody. My name's Alan Ware. I'm a Global Coordinator of PNND, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-proliferation and Disarmament. Today I'm calling in from Geneva and I welcome everybody to the webinar today, which is on common security, nuclear risks, and the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in the wake of the Ukraine conflict. I'll be co-chairing this event with Wanda Proskova, who will introduce herself soon. You may see her on the screen. We will be holding this event today in two short panels in order to be able to have questions and answers from participants sooner rather than later. The event today is coming just the week before the annual session of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, which has been held in Birmingham in the United Kingdom. And the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly provides a platform for parliamentarians and also civil society through our parliamentary representatives to engage in critical issues of security in the wider European context. And I say wider European context because the OSCE takes in countries within Europe, all of the European countries, all of the former Soviet countries, also Canada and the United States. Some people say it stretches from Vancouver to Vladivostok. I think it stretches a little further than that because it takes in Alaska as well. But it's a broader embrace, I think, of security issues that is, in a sense, is global in its impact, but is revolves around cooperation, dialogue, communication, conflict resolution, building democracy, human rights, addressing critical issues in a cooperative common security way. That's the idea of the OSCE. So today, of course, we're looking at what role these common security mechanisms. OSCE is not the only common security mechanism. Now, of course, key international one or global one is the United Nations. But in particular, we're looking at the OSCE today because there's been issues that's very difficult in the European context with the military operation or the war in the Ukraine. It's not the only issue that is, of course, of concern. And we have climate change issues. We have other human rights issues. But the armed conflict in Ukraine is impacting on so much. And here, of course, is the question of what role can the OSCE play? Is it still important? And that's part of the context of today. We're very, very thankful to the special representative of OSCE Parliamentary Assembly for engaging with civil society, for hosting a consultation which happened a couple of weeks ago, which again was opening the possibility for civil society to engage with the OSCE and the Parliamentary Assembly in particular. We're also very thankful to all the members of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, the delegates from national parliaments, for being open to consulting and to be listening to the views of their constituents and others in their preparation for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly next week. We are focusing mostly on the issues that have been raised by the first committee on peace and international security, and of course, two other key committees within the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And in the context of the first committee, a number of our members of Parliament, PNND, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-proliferation and Disarmament, made some proposals, and some of those proposals have been picked up and are going to be brought into the deliberations. In particular, two of the ones that were picked up was a proposal that the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly reaffirm the old Reagan-Gorbachev dictum, which is that a nuclear war cannot be won and so must never be fought, and then to give some support to implementing that through encouraging nuclear risk reduction measures, including adoption by all nuclear weapon states of no first use policies. And another proposal has been put forward by PNND members have been to focus on the upcoming Non-proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which will happen at the United Nations in New York for 4 weeks this year in August, the first time the states parties to the Non-proliferation Treaty have been able to come together for over 7 years. Normally it's 5 years between review conferences, but it's critical because it was the agreement by non-nuclear states not to acquire nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon states to work for nuclear disarmament. So here we're looking forward to possibilities of progress there, and some of our members have put forward ideas about taking forward the obligation for nuclear disarmament, including by putting forward a time-bound framework, that there should be the objective, the vision for the global elimination of nuclear weapons by 2045, the 100th anniversary of the United Nations and the 75th anniversary of the Non-proliferation Treaty. So these are some of the proposals. There will be other ones that we discussed today, and we hope that there will be a good exchange in a cooperative and respectful manner. I'm going to pass over to Vanda, who will talk a little about the process of how the panels will work, and will introduce the first panel. So thank you very much. Vanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan, and hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be here. It's so amazing to see some familiar faces, but also to meet so many new ones. I'm excited that so many people have decided to talk about common security with us today. So my name is Vanda. I'm the Vice Chair of Prague Vision Institute for Sustainable Security, and also a core team member of Youth Fusion, which is a working group of Abolition 2000. So just a couple of remarks on the technical aspect of today's events. As Alan's mentioned before, there will be a Q&A at the end of each panel. So we do look forward to your questions. To have your questions answered, please put them in the Q&A box, which should be available to you already. It will stay open and remain open throughout the whole event. So please put your questions there. The chat, I'm so happy that most of you have already found that tool also. The chat should also stay open. However, please note that the chat is only for short comments, links, or just brief notes only. It is really not suited for any long analysis or personal attacks. The chat is being monitored, so just please be respectful towards one another. We recognize that there is a whole variety of opinions on the issues discussed today, which is amazing because that makes for a great debate. But we would love to uphold really a culture of respect, both on the screen and in the chat. And a final note before I can introduce the first panel. You may have noticed that the session is being recorded and is also live streamed on Facebook. So if you missed something, or if you really have a good time and want to rewatch later, you will have that option to do so. So without further ado, allow me to introduce the first panel of speakers. Today we have Christine Mutzenen, who's the PNND co-president and also a former president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Hello, we've got Alexandra Likotal of the Geneva School of Diplomacy and former president of Green Cross International. And he also served as the deputy spokesman and advisor to the president of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev. Hello. And the final speaker of the first panel is Andrea Zuma, an award-winning journalist and political analyst with focus on UN and security issues. It's an absolute honor to have you all here. So I will kick off the first panel by asking each of the panelists for a short, maybe 3-minute long introductory remarks from everyone. So Ms. Mutzenen, the floor is yours for the first remarks.
Thank you very much, Wanda. Thank you, Alan. I'm very pleased to be here. Greetings to all of you, wherever you are. From a very hot southern Austria. It's a pleasure being here with you. I've seen there are so many experts who are listening, so it's really a wonderful coming together. Just recently, someone quoted Albert Einstein having said, and you probably know the quote, "I do not know with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." And I think this is such a good quote that you should really repeat it again and again, because it shows where we are heading towards. Today, we are in a situation which we haven't imagined 1 year ago. Even then, 1 year ago, the amount of nuclear weapons was far too high. And even then, we all tried to make people aware that far too much money is being spent for nuclear weapons. Money that is urgently needed to fulfill the SDGs, ranging from eradicating poverty and famine to a better education for all, and money to combat climate change and create a healthy environment for all. And now with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, with this terrible tragedy that followed and is still going on, the only possibility for countries seems to start an enormous militarization. Today, the term demilitarization is an unknown word, obviously, dating back to a long time ago. The escalation circle has started and we do not know the end yet. At the same time, we face impacts on the energy supply and the interruption of the food chain, consequences on the ecosystem and on climate change. And we face an increase in nuclear rhetoric. We hear nuclear threats and talks about the so-called small, tactical, better usable nuclear bombs, as if these bombs would not kill and destroy. Research proves that they have terrible effects regionally as well as globally and easily trigger further escalation. The vicious circle of the illusion of peace through nuclear deterrence contains more weapons, more nuclear tests, more money put into the production. And CPRI, the Stockholm Peace Research Institute, says global arsenals are expected to grow as states continue to modernize. Neither does this balance of terror prevent war, nor does it mean victory, because we know who shoots first dies second. This leads to a rising feeling of uncertainty, insecurity, and fear within the population. What we need is risk reduction, an inclusive approach, a focus finally on the fulfillment of the SDGs, and thus a focus on the humanitarian situation of the people. And this is where the OSCE has to come in. This imperfect but indispensable, absolutely necessary organization with its strength in dealing with conflicts. And Alan already said the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe exists of 57 countries, reaching very far, Vladivostok to Vancouver, Alaska, as you said. It's the largest regional security organization and is a platform for dialogue, a platform most of the time, the only one where parties still sit at the same table, and that's really its strength. And next week, the 56 nations will meet for the annual session of the Parliamentary Assembly in Birmingham. And you can be sure that the war in the Ukraine will be the main topic. There will be resolutions, discussions, declarations about how peace can be restored and how the cruel suffering of the people can be stopped. And there will be discussions about the prohibition of weapons which destroy our civilization, so that in the end we will work and fight with sticks and stones again, or not even that. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, so much for these welcome remarks. And thank you also for giving us a little taste of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. I think we're all extremely excited and interested in what that brings. So thank you for reminding us also that that's happening soon. Now I'll ask Mr. Alexandru Licotel for his opening remarks. 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, though I would have paid dearly not to have this subject for the discussion. The Russian aggression actually has already been devastating Ukraine already for months. Tens of thousands dead, hundreds of thousands lives ruined, millions of refugees. Just yesterday, the Group of Seven summit in the Bavarian Alps has started. Russia marked this event with a missile attack on Kiev and other cities. And President Zelensky, in his nightly address, said that this confirms that sanctions packages against Russian aggression are not enough, that Ukraine needs more armed assistance and particularly air defense systems. The first report from G7 sounded quite upbeat. Leaders of the G7 confirmed their solidarity with Ukraine and agreed to ban importing gold from Russia. This will deprive it of about 19 billion a year. Tomorrow, there will be another meeting. NATO is meeting, and it will hold the most important summit, I would say, since its creation. But it still looks divided over how far to go in Ukraine. And yet, G7 today and NATO leaders tomorrow will come to the meeting burdened by challenges at home that will inevitably filter into discussions about where next in Ukraine, what to do about the price of petrol, what to do with the Russian gas, weaponization, how to wean themselves off Russian oil, what to do with the global food security crisis, and are we really headed for a global recession now? We have to stay together, Joseph Biden said. Well, have to stay and be together, not the same. Let's not count the chickens until they hatch. There is a general feeling of the war routinization now. The interest of social media users in the events in Ukraine fell 22 times since its beginning. There is also a palpable fatigue in the West. During the recent visit to Kiev, the leaders of France, Germany, and Italy actually denied Zelensky an accelerated supply of heavy weapons. All three are concerned with the economic consequences of the war, from a looming global food crisis to a sharp rise in energy prices in their countries. The West wants to live well. It's normal. The Ukrainians also want to live. The West shares, in fact, basic principle. It argued that it should be Ukraine to determine at what conditions and at what point it is ready to discuss peace with the aggressor. However, there are visible nuances. Today, there are two camps, the camp of, let me say, victory and the camp of peace. Both claim that will back the decision of Ukraine. What is the difference? Peace fraction is ready to negotiate with Putin. Victory fraction wants to crush the regime and talk only then. And I think in this vein, the decision to grant Ukraine an European Union official candidate status, does it hint at more assertive European Union embracing countries on its eastern flank? Or is it a consolation prize for prioritizing negotiations over winning for Ukraine? The logic of Macron, Scholz, and Draghi, which they are trying to inject into the rest of the ranks of NATO, everything will still end with a ceasefire agreement. It will, but the devil is in the details. What is the demarcation line of a truce? 2013 line, maybe February 23rd line. Is it the current situation? I'm a historian, and I can tell you that precedents show that usually the ceasefire or truce agreements are based on the agreement date line.
Alexander, I will just ask you to wrap up quickly within a minute, if that's possible.
Sure, okay.
Thank you.
The occupied territory, 20% of Ukraine and growing now, and it is comparable to Czech Republic and Slovakia combined, almost all of England, 2/3 of Italy. Can you imagine Ukrainians swallow it? I cannot. And on top of it, it's a delusion to think that any deal is feasible yet. A truce or ceasefire becomes possible only when the point of sort of dynamic equilibrium of the war is reached. This is a moment in the war at which the parties realize the futility of further efforts to destroy the enemy, since their efforts result also in unacceptable damage to themselves. The idea of unacceptable damage is subjective, and each side has its own. And today, when Russia advances in the east of Ukraine, gradually expanding its control, unilateral desire to end the war will not lead to its termination. I will stop at that.
Thank you so much for these open introductory remarks. I completely agree with you. It is an incredibly divisive topic, but that only leads me to thank everyone here for coming together to discuss all of this. It's really an amazing venue. So the final introductory welcome words from the first panel. I'll ask Mr. Andrea Zuma for his brief remarks. And I'll also ask him to unmute himself.
You have to, okay. I start again. We have been sent written questions in preparation for this panel, and I thought it would make sense to answer these questions. The first question was whether or not we would support what also the draft resolution for the Birmingham OSCE EPA already supports economic sanctions and legal measures, or whether we think military support, as has been described already by Alexander, is necessary, or even more of that. I think on principle, economic sanctions would be the right way to go, but after 4 months of war, it shows that they obviously don't have the effect yet, at least. The gas exports of Russia to China and India have increased by 55%, and the world price has increased. So whatever effect the sanctions so far had has been outbalanced by this. And I think if the West would really mean business in terms of sanctions, then there should be a full-fledged sanction, both on gas, coal, and oil, plus the gold that has been mentioned. This might have an effect in a midterm, but not the limited sanctions that have been decided upon so far. So I think it's up to the Western governments and the populations whether they're really willing to sacrifice the potential negative consequences for the next winter, which I think, as severe as these consequences might be, they would be still much less severe than what the Ukrainian people have suffered so far and will suffer in the future. On the military support, I mean, Alexander is much more a military expert than I am, but all military experts, serious ones, I know, those who don't have a political agenda, agree that even with all the difficulties the Russian army had in the first few days and weeks, the Russian military superiority is so high, not only as far as Air Force is concerned, but the number of artillery pieces, the range of artillery, you know all the facts, that it seemed to be impossible to give Ukraine enough weapons to at least create some kind of military balance. And if this is true, then the dilemma is whether Ukraine will stop this self-defense war now and have certain degree of defeat and then negotiate, or in many, many months with many, 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 many more civilians dead and much more destruction. I know it's a very cynical, very bitter dilemma, but this is the dilemma if this analysis that the Russian military superiority cannot be outbalanced. And I think we should stop trying to criticize certain European governments because they're allegedly less reluctant or more reluctant than others. President Biden has last week very clearly marked the line, which is a common line of NATO. Yes, we send heavy weapons. We don't send any Air Force weapons. We will not engage in any kind of airspace control or whatever, and we will not send troops, and we will not send artillery pieces with a range of more than 40 kilometers. This is not just a German or Italian or French government line. This is the common line agreed by all NATO countries. The second question we have been asked is whether there are ways to reduce the risk of nuclear escalation and whether the West could right now do something. Well, I think it might be helpful. There's no guarantee for anything if the OSCE Parliamentarians Assembly would address both the West and Russia to stop any forms of so-called modernization that is ongoing on nuclear weapons on both sides, appeal to the West and especially to the US to finally ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and appeal to the US and to NATO to give up the first strike option, and appeal to Putin to withdraw the nuclear threat he made, which is in effect withdrawing from the position Russia and the Soviet Union took since '89, when they gave up the first strike option. I think there might be a chance, if there is an address by the OSCE to both sides, that this might have an impact. My biggest concern is that the one issue where the P5, the five official nuclear powers, at least for the last 9 years agreed upon, was to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear weapon power. And this common line of the P5 is dwindling away because Russia is more and more getting out of this common position, and maybe China also. And this might lead to less pressure on the Iranian government and to a final failure of the Vienna negotiations trying to save the nuclear agreement, which was left by the Trump administration. And if this is the development, then the danger of a military escalation in the form of the US, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other states going militarily against Iran will become the real nuclear or the real risk of a new war in the very near future. And I think the OSCE should also address itself next week to this real danger. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for going straight to the questions. So as just a reminder to the participants, if you'd like your question answered, please put in the Q&A box, not the chat. The chat's getting really crowded, which is amazing. It's great to see a discussion going, but it's impossible for us to find the questions you're asking. So any question you're interested in having answered, please put it in the Q&A box. So we already have some questions in the Q&A box, but let me just use a little the role of the moderator and kick this round up with the first two questions. I know that Andreas has already answered some of them, but let me just restate them for the audience also. So as you all by now know, Europe and the US have initiated a strong set of economic sanctions against Russia, and the draft resolution to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly supports a number of legal measures to address the Russian aggression against Ukraine, this includes, for example, the case in the International Court of Justice and the investigation in the International Criminal Court. So the question is, can these economic and legal measures have any influence on Russia, or should the international community instead rely primarily or solely on military support for Ukraine? Any of you, if you'd like to give it a go at answering this question briefly, that'd be fantastic. And I know that some of you have already touched upon this, but I think it'd be lovely if we could devote some time just to this. Yes, please, Christine. And you'll need to unmute yourself.
So now you can hear me. Thank you very much. Andreas has already touched a lot of things, and I think, yes, military support is important. The question is, how far can we go, the Western countries? sanctions are needed. Today, new sanctions are imposed on Russia. But I really want to speak for the way which we shouldn't forget. We should have to make all efforts to keep the channels for dialogue open. Diplomacy is needed as much as never before, and de-escalation is needed on all levels. So, of course, the leading person should start and meet, but I think it's very important to have this kind of dialogue on all levels. And the OSCE, the governmental side is blocked by this consensus rule. The Parliamentary Assembly is not blocked by that. They can't make decisions, but they can make declarations. They can put the finger into, you know, where it hurts, and make it public. And I think the Parliamentary Assembly is already undertaking a lot of measures. For example, next week in Birmingham, I don't think that Russians will be there, but at least the others will talk about the issue of the Ukraine, about the war that goes on. A lack of dialogue usually goes hand in hand with a crisis of understanding. So what the Parliamentary Assembly, for example, did, they announced a special representative for parliamentary dialogue on the Ukraine, so that in a way they start talking to each other again. They provide aid directly to the Ukraine. They focus on migration, on trafficking, mainly female trafficking, which is awful. We also talk about what justice. That justice is required. Long-term peace will require justice. And there is a nomination of a special rapporteur on war crimes in the Ukraine. So also here the Parliamentary Assembly steps in. And then we also have to think about the post-war time, because Ukraine is, for example, one of the most densely mined countries in the world now, and they really need every possible help after the war. The special monitoring missions were not successful in the end, but for a long period, there was the possibility, they managed to have ceasefires, even if there were small ceasefires and even if they were broken, but still they were there. And that's why I think it is so important to have these discussions and to have undertake all possibilities to get into dialogue again. And I hope very much that if they start on the level of parliamentarians, that at least there is one little step ahead. I know it's not much, but we have to use that, because otherwise we only have the weapons and the sanctions, and that's not enough. Thank you.
Thank you for this hopeful answer. Please, Alexander, go ahead.
Okay. Well, actually, sanctions are, of course, very important. And I would say that in the longer run, they might undermine economic development of Russia. However, Putin and his elite do not care about economic growth and development. They only care about income. And they still receive income from the sale of energy resources. Since the beginning of war, the Russian Federation accumulated more than 100 billion in foreign currency, and the budget surplus is over $300 billion. Recently, I read, I think it was in Spiegel, Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater and the Wall Street Legend, he said in the magazine recently that Putin would only be in trouble if the economy collapsed by, say, 40%. But such a prospect is hardly visible, although much here will depend on the position of states like India in the situation of an international boycott of Moscow, because India, by the way, increased Russian oil imports 50 times from April to June of this year.
What I said.
Sorry?
That's what I said. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're just repeating. Yeah.
Well, you know, good fact is worth repeating. Thank you.
Yeah.
The main question is why sanctions? What is the goal of sanctions? And I assume that the West thinks about sanctions working firstly in their deterrent function, preventing war, their compelling function, trying to force the Kremlin to end its war, maybe a regime change in Russia, well, which is a pretty ambitious goal, and the deep degrading of Russian power, tearing out its, let me say, war teeth. Right now, it's not clear what aim is on the agenda. It's only clear that number one did not work because the war happened. Number two does not work as expected. Russia is advancing in East Ukraine. And besides, there are too many loopholes with gas, with oil, lots of loopholes. And then, of course, in the West, they believe that sanctions will create some difficulties for dictator and those who are around him. I hate to disappoint, because Putin couldn't care less about sanctions, how his surrounding feels, because his surrounding is more scared than nostalgic about the time when they were used to travel to the West, living in their residences there, etc., etc. And also, West forgets about the different pain threshold in Russia and the West. That's very important not to forget. I will stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. So I would like to also in the chat, I've seen some comments on no first use and the nuclear aspect of the conflict. And that sort of brings me to another question that I would like to pose. So obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has elevated the risks of nuclear war. I think we all can agree on that. So the question goes, are there ways to reduce these risks through nuclear restraint from the West? Promotion of policies such as no first use, I think that was also mentioned in the chat already, by nuclear weapon states, and keeping an open dialogue with Russia on strategic doctrines. It's a heavy question, but I'd like for briefer answers. Again, whoever would like to take the floor.
Okay, I will take the floor first. I think the argument about sanctions, I think, Alexander, it remains to be seen. If the West would really, I repeat, put in a full-fledged sanction embargo on all these vital energy resources, this might have an impact. But the fact is, there is no preparedness yet, neither by Western governments and possibly also not by Western populations, and therefore in the end we might come to the same result. But on the nuclear question, I already said yes, it's at least worth a try if the parliamentarians at the meeting in Birmingham come out with a clear, not a diplomatic, but a clear declaration to both sides to stop, I repeat, any ongoing so-called modernization which destabilizes the situation in Europe. This is not only the Iskander missiles which are now being deployed or supposed to be deployed in Kaliningrad. This is also the so-called modernization of the nuclear weapons in Germany and the other 5 NATO member countries where you have US weapons, and many more programs you all know about. So it would maybe have an effect. Secondly, it would be very important to clearly confront the legend that is widespread, at least in Western media and government rhetoric, which is if the Ukraine would not have given up the Soviet nuclear weapons that were on the territory, and signed onto the Budapest Memorandum back in '94, which clearly has been broken now by Putin. If Ukraine would have not done that, then it would have not been attacked now. I think this is baloney, to be blunt, because the Ukrainian government never had any effective control and no possibility to use these nuclear weapons. The effective control was always with the government in Moscow. So the Ukraine never had an effective nuclear deterrent, which it had given up, and therefore now it's being attacked. And this is the same dangerous narrative like the one after the British-American war against Iraq 2003, where in many, many capitals of the South, not only in autocratic or dictatorial, but also in democratic countries, the perception was if Saddam Hussein would have only had the nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction the British and the American government were lying about, then he would have never been attacked. And this kind of perception is undermining the already very fragile non-proliferation regime, and is a danger also for the upcoming conference in New York. So one should very clearly speak out against this, and it would be helpful if the parliamentary meeting would do that.
Christine or Alexandra, would you also like to answer the question on risks of nuclear war?
Yes, if I may. I think what we have is, and what we already did. Sorry, does it work? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you very well.
Okay, it just showed something here. I think we have to closely work together with civil society. So parliamentarians, for example, they are the bridge very often between the governments and civil society. So when you think of the Treaty of the Prohibition of the Nuclear Weapons, so there was this the impact on the humanitarian issues was put in the center. So it was not so much about the legal issue, it was mankind that was put in the center. Very practical. What happens to your city when there is a nuclear war? What can happen? When you think of the Mayors for Peace, for example, then I think you have a big group of people who really work for or against nuclear weapons. So the working together of the environment, of the population, of the civil society with parliamentarians is very, very important. And I think there are possibilities, for example, like the no first use policies. There are different possibilities to carry along this thought. And I think this might help if you go to the if you open the discussion to not the experts only, but if you open the discussion to the public and the civil society, because it hasn't been a thought of concern for people for a long time, but now it is, and now we have to use this and ask the people to put pressure on their governments. But of course, I know it's very difficult in Russia. It's difficult in the States where the governments have the nuclear weapons, but still we have to try and do that. So there is also the possibility of thinking not wasting so much money. I think the idea what PNND and the other organizations did, that showing how much money is put into nuclear weapons, which you could use instead of which you could use for whatever. You could use it for the people, you could use it for a better education, you could use it against poverty, against famine, etc., etc. The visualization which you did, I think, was a very good thing. So this point, for example, should continue, or you should take it up again and make it clear to the people. And I think the illusion that nuclear weapons prevent major wars has burst like a soap bubble now. On the contrary, nuclear weapons rather embolden states sometimes to start war. Why not trying to gain a win-win situation for all by forbidding those terrible weapons? Thank you.
Thank you for that answer, and also to everyone interested in the project that Christine's mentioned. It was titled "Move the Nuclear Weapons Money," and it is still available online on social media. So if you give a search, "Move the Nuclear Weapons Money," it's a very interesting program to check out. So I'm seeing a really interesting question in the Q&A, which I think we could spend a couple of minutes on. The question is from Frederick Pearson, and who asks that about the Minsk agreement and why it felt it was a key OSCE accomplishment, and it seems there is a lot of fault on all sides for its downfall. So if any of you would be interested in commenting on that.
Yes, I would be.
Like a minute answer, just because there's a lot of questions we need to get.
No, a minute will not be possible. Others have also talked much longer than agreed. So if you want to have a serious debate, you give me a little more than a minute. Number one, it was not originally OSCE made. It was the initiative of two of Western governments. This was the former German Chancellor and the French, who did it against the will at the time of the US, who started arming Ukraine from end of 2014. We should be very specific about that. The signals that have been sent from different Western NATO countries to Ukraine after the illegal annexation of the Crimea and the beginning of the civil war in the Donbass have been very different. And it was only after this successful first Minsk agreement that the OSCE adopted that. And the problem is, and I'm a huge fan of the OSCE and the CSE since 50 years, and I wished it would have become our common collective security system after '99 with strong personal, financial, logistical resources. We all know that didn't happen, and that the OSCE, after many months of deliberations, only came up with 236 observers for this huge country. Be serious, it was a bad joke. We would have needed 2,000 or 5,000 in order to have a de-escalating effect. So there is a big failure because member countries didn't give the resources that would have been necessary for the OSCE to have an effect. And why did Minsk fail? Let me give you an anecdote, which we just heard from Mr. Biden's autobiography. At the Munich Security Conference in February 2015, where Mr. Biden came as Obama's vice president, and he gave a speech which was basically a sales pitch for fracking gas from the US. There was a meeting between him and Angela Merkel, the former chancellor. Merkel had asked him, they met in a hotel room in Munich. Merkel had just come back from the Minsk II negotiations in Minsk, and she urged him to say when he talked about Minsk, that both sides, not only the Russian-based separatists, but also the Ukrainian army did violate the Minsk agreements. And she gave him all the OSCE reports, which clearly proved this point. And Biden did on purpose the opposite. He only struck out at the Russian separatists, accusing them of violating the Minsk I agreement. And in his memories, he is writing, Angela Merkel must have been pretty mad about me. Yeah. So this is a fact. It failed because both sides did not stick to it, and because the OSCE did not have enough man and woman power and other resources on the ground to really enforce the agreement. And this is a pity still. And if we want to change that in the future, there have to be much more personal, financial, logistical, and political resources put into the OSCE to make it an effective instrument.
Thank you for that answer. Alexandra, would you also like to comment on the Minsk agreement? Very briefly.
Certainly, thank you very much. Actually, I would agree with many things that Andreas has said. and particularly with the control of the nuclear weapons during the transition period from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That's absolutely true. The control was totally in the hands of Russia at that period of time. But anyway, it's a long story, and I don't think that we have time for that. Anyway, I think that as long as the nuclear weapons are there, they might be used. So possibility is always there. Is the possibility higher now when we have this aggression and invasion in Ukraine? Well, might be to a fraction of percent, but generally, if you ask me about the probability, I will still argue that it is less than 1%. Talking about nuclear weapons, about its destructive power, even less than 1% is too much. And that means that, of course, everything that could be done in order to resolve this situation, or at least alleviate the consequences and this whatever today happens, needs to be done. And in my judgment, I was thinking about what could be done today, practically, on site, in order to achieve practical results. I think that we have the problem, first, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, then the failure of European security architecture as a result of this conflict, and also, of course, the huge destabilization of the strategic situation and growing risks strategically. Therefore, it seems to me that what is needed is the establishment of an international contact group to support and assist future negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And I think that should be done on the basis not even of the nation's representation, but OSCE and other institutions that are involved in the international security agenda. Then I think the establishment of multilateral talks on European security, because after the failure of this European architecture, it will be needed to rebuild anew. It's not possible anymore just to recombine the elements of the destroyed building of the European house, let me say, or European security structure. We will need to think about the new structure. And finally, of course, it is absolutely necessary to resume the US-Russian strategic stability dialogue and to continue the discussions on the strategic risk reductions by the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Ultimately, these are the first steps, because I think that what was achieved by the Russian aggression, this is upended world order system that existed since the end of the Second World War and in certain modifications after the end of the Cold War. And it's clear that with the absence of this world order new governance system, we will be going through a very turbulent world, even if this situation with Ukraine will be in the nearest future resolved in some way. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as John's mentioned in the chat, I hope you're right about the 1%. So before giving the floor to Christine, I would also like to just feed another question, which might be best for Christine to answer. In the Q&A, you can find it. It's from Marion Boker, who says that women's NGOs have aligned with those of Ukraine, but it's been difficult finding women's NGOs from Russia. And as we know, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 says that both need to be included in all peace dialogues and negotiations. So the question is whether you think that the OSCE will keep this in mind and will be able to bring an open-minded Russian women into the discussion. So Christine, over to you if you could briefly answer these questions.
Thank you very much. First, I want to add something to the discussion before. I think it's very important to build a new European security architecture, and I think it is going to be very difficult because there is this the northern countries also joining NATO, so there is a NATO discussion, but not a European security discussion. So we have to have a real discussion how Europe is going to deal with that. And the second thing is because Andreas mentioned that there is a need for many more special monitoring missions and personnel. I think we should be aware that the OSCE has a very, very low budget and is fighting for its budget all the time. And I think now, maybe now the government start realizing that this platform is absolutely needed and will help the OSCE also to do its work by paying them the money they should, or maybe even a little bit more, so that the OSCE doesn't have this problem with the low budget all the time. And about engaged women, I'm very, very much for having more women, especially in foreign policy and especially in security policy, because it's really a male domain. How difficult it will be with Russian women, I can't tell really, because we have to use all the different channels. Everybody who has this possibility to know somebody, to know a group, to know groups of women in Russia. So it will be easier after the war, certainly, because you have to have women at the negotiation table. Then it is proof that it works better. So 1325 is absolutely necessary, and the OSCE, the Parliamentary Assembly, is very much for having more women among the delegates, and there is even a special representative for women's issue, gender issues. It's Hedi Frey from Canada. And she is also very much supporting PNND and very much working against nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with this, Hedi, if you're watching, greetings to Ms. Hedi Frey. I would like to thank so much Christine, Alexandra, and Andreas for being here with us for the first panel of today's event. I would now like to pass the floor to Alan, who will guide us through panel 2. And yeah, thank you, everyone. It's been a lovely and extremely informative panel. So thank you. It's been amazing.
Well, thank you very much, Vanda, for facilitating the first panel. Thank you very much to the 3 speakers. The dialogue was very rich, and I know we could have kept that discussion going for another hour or even more, but we do have another 3 really interesting people. Also, so far we've only managed to deal with a few of the questions in the Q&A box. We will attempt a few more of them after the 3 panelists in the second panel, but I also invite the 3 panelists, especially from the first panel, that if you take the time to look through the Q&A in the box, please feel free to answer some of those in written form, because we're not going to be able to get to them all at the end of the second panel. So it gives me really great pleasure then to introduce first the 3 speakers of the second panel, and then we'll follow the same sort of process as we did with the first one. That is, each of the speakers will have opening comments of around about 3 minutes to give general perspectives, and then we'll come back with questions to the panelists, and we've got 2 starter questions from us, and then we'll go on to the Q&A from the audience. So the three panelists we have for the second panel is retired General Bernard Nolan, who's the president of Initiatives pour le Disarmament Nucléaire, a French think tank, and is the former air defense commander of the French Air Force. And then wonderful to have you with us, General Nolan. Our second speaker is Ute Zapf from Germany, who's the former chair of the Bundestag Subcommittee on Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-proliferation. And she was also the vice president or the deputy chair of the German delegation to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And she was one of the first co-presidents of Parliamentarians for Nuclear, Non-proliferation and Disarmament. So Ute, it's wonderful to have you with us. And then our third panelist, and panel two, is Jackie Cabasso from the United States. She's the executive director of Western States Legal Foundation. She's also the North American coordinator for Mayors for Peace. And she also has roles in a number of other civil society organizations like Abolition 2000, and I think also International Peace Bureau. So thank you, Jackie, for joining us. So we'll start off again, short rounds to start with. General Nolan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Helene. Thank you, Wanda. Okay, I will speak very briefly before the next questions and the discussion. And I will begin because after the dismantling of major international agreements undertaken mainly by Donald Trump, the aggression of Ukraine by Russia in violation of all treaties and international law shattered the European security architecture. The OSCE is one of the few remaining organizations, but it is already very weakened, while the conflict in Ukraine is not only not over yet, but even more so, while there is no end in sight. The question of its survival now arises, and in the best case, the question of the role it can and will be able to play in the reconstruction of European security. One certainty in this strategic institutional chaos is the difficulty of providing precise and solid answers. Faced with this difficulty and navigating between the darkest pessimism of the OSCE decades and the optimism of its glorious rebirth, we must strive to construct the most plausible scenarios possible. To do so, we must, first of all, rely on history by recalling the role played by the OSCE during the Cold War and the height of the 80s, with its founding document, the Helsinki Final Act and its Decalogue, but also on the fact that it remains one of the only remaining multilateral spaces outside the UN for dialogue between Russia and the West, and even more so, a forum that brings together countries from Vancouver to Vladivostok. For these reasons, the survival of the OSCE must be ensured, but it remains to be determined how it can be adapted to the new realities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General Nolan. I now turn the floor to Ute Zapf. Ute, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm really honored to be part of this discussion. It is 50 years ago that I joined the Social Democratic Party in Germany. My motivation was the policy of détente of Willy Brandt, the idea of reconciliation after World War II, and the concept of transformation through trade or change through rapprochement appealed to me. In 1975, a Helsinki Final Act of the Conference of Security and Cooperation was an important result of these political endeavors. It was a milestone in the European peace policy. In 1982, the groundbreaking Olof Palme report was issued. Olof Palme and Willy Brandt, together with Egon Bahr, worked closely together in formulating a policy of common security. In 1990, the Charter of the New Europe of the OSCE was issued and decided on, and a year later, the Parliamentarian Assembly was founded. In 1995, the conference was converted into an organization, and I think it's a very important organization until this time and should be protected. For decades, these policies were successful in upholding peace in Europe. Nowadays, it is quite popular to denounce them, but this narrative of denunciation is completely wrong. Peace, a common security means organizing security together, not against each other, and peace and common security needs cooperation, trust, arms control and disarmament, and the rule of law. Common security today is lying in a deathbed. The rule-based order is eroding, tensions and crises are growing worldwide, treaties and international agreements are being ignored or revoked, an arms race is in progress. There are growing dangers from pandemics, hunger and poverty is rising, and on top we have the war against Ukraine, which aggravates all global problems. So we need everything within our power to stop the decline, for our shared future to regain common security, as the 2022 report of the Olof Palme International Center describes it. We must restore the principles that have been violated within our security organizations, like in the UN Charter and within the OSCE. We have to fight the nuclear threat. We have to fight, in addition, the dangers of climate change and of the deteriorating environment. We have to implement the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals to have a human security policy. And we have to use every possible opportunity in our organization and go on with the discussion, fighting all of these dangers together. The former panel mentioned G7, and before us is the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, which is extremely important, I think, but also the NATO summit is really important, and we should see to it that in all these premier and in addition also in the UN, our principles can be reinstalled or maybe found new principles that come to the effect of a common security for Europe and the whole world.
Thank you very much, Uta. You gave a very good description of what common security is and some historical background to the OSCE, the important role it plays and the important role of the Parliamentary Assembly. General Nolan also talked about the importance of the OSCE, and so both of you had given aspects of why it's important today, maybe even more so, but also looking at things from both a historical and a current perspective is very important because it can help us frame how we're taking things forward. So thank you very much for those. We now have a voice coming from the United States, where perhaps the OSCE may not be quite so well known as in Europe, and yet Jackie Cabasso, who's going to speak next, has been elevating some of these ideas, including through Mayors for Peace. So Jackie, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to talk a little bit about the concept of human security and the role of civil society. In a post-Cold War presentation to NGOs, Dr. Mahbub ul Haq, head of the United Nations Development Program, spoke eloquently of the need for fundamental transformation in the concept of security, which he described as, quote, the security of people, not just of territory, the security of individuals, not just of nations, security through development, not through arms, security of all the people everywhere in their homes, in their jobs, in their streets, in their communities, and in their environment, end quote. This new interpretation, he explained, requires us to regard human security as, quote, universal, global, and indivisible, end quote. In other words, it applies equally to all people everywhere and supersedes the notion of national security enforced by military power, in some cases overwhelming military power. It seems to me that the OSCE, in its foundational document, the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, and reaffirmed in the 1990 Charter of Paris for a New Europe, bridges the concepts of common security and human security. As stated on the OSCE website today, quote, the OSCE's comprehensive concept of security covers the political, military, the economic and environmental, and the human security dimensions, end quote. At the subnational level, mayors are calling on their national governments to pursue common security while emphasizing the need for universal human security. Mayors for Peace, founded in 1982 and headed by the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is working for a world without nuclear weapons, safe and resilient cities, and a culture of peace as essential measures for the realization of durable world peace. As of June 1st, 2022, Mayors for Peace has grown to 8,174 cities in 166 countries and regions, representing over 1 billion people. For 17 consecutive years, the United States Conference of Mayors, the official nonpartisan association of US cities with populations over 30,000, has adopted strong resolutions submitted by US members of Mayors for Peace. On June 6, 2022, the US Conference of Mayors adopted a sweeping new resolution titled Forging a Path to Peace and Common Security. The resolution opens with this blunt assessment, quote, whereas a new report, Common Security 2022 for Our Shared Future, sponsored by the Olof Palme Memorial Fund, finds that, quote, in 2022, humanity faces the existential threats of nuclear war, climate change, and pandemics. This is compounded by a toxic mix of inequality, extremism, nationalism, gender violence, and shrinking democratic space. How humanity responds to these threats will decide our very survival, end quote. Addressing the need for common security, the resolution, quote, calls on the President and Congress to exercise restraint in US military engagement in Ukraine while maximizing diplomatic efforts to end the war as soon as possible by working with Ukraine and Russia for an immediate ceasefire and negotiations with mutual concessions in conformity with the United Nations Charter, knowing that the risks of wider war grow the longer the war continues, end quote. In alignment with PNND's recommendation to the upcoming 29th annual session of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, the resolution, quote, calls on the US and the other nuclear armed states parties to the NPT at the August 2022 10th Review Conference of the treaty to implement their disarmament obligations by committing to a process leading to the adoption no later than 2030 of a time-bound plan for the global elimination of nuclear weapons by 2045, end quote. And addressing the need for human security, the resolution, quote, calls on the administration and Congress to rein in military and nuclear weapons spending and to redirect funds to support safe and resilient cities and meet human needs, including by providing accessible and affordable health care for all, housing and food security, green sustainable energy, and environmental protection and mitigation, and to increase investment in international diplomacy, humanitarian assistance and development, and international cooperation to address the climate crisis, end quote. I don't have time to go into it, but I'm also working with other US NGO formations advocating this dual common security, human security approach, including United for Peace and Justice and the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. And just to let audience participants know that I did put the link in the chat session to the resolution adopted by the US Conference of Mayors, and a commendation to you for your role in helping draft and get that resolution adopted. And that is very much an educative role, educating many of the mayors about these common security and human security aspects. It was very good also that you introduced the idea of human security, which is starting to become a part of the major push for the United Nations. It embraces also the goals, the United Nations goals of achieving sustainable development goals and climate protection. and also the connection between the Olof Palme's idea of common security and human security. That's been made quite clearly in the new report of the Common Security Commission, which was just released in, I think it was March this year, where it starts off that, you know, human security is a core aspect of a part of ensuring that we have common security. So there's a lot of crossover, a lot of intersection between those, and they work very, very well together. And you'll see that there is a lot of, you know, the emphasizing one in one context and another in another context. On the common security side, which is where there's, you know, a lot of focus at the moment, war prevention, resolving conflicts. In the draft resolution to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, which has been discussed next week, there is a paragraph which I think is important to reflect on. It says in this paragraph that the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly highlights the role of the OSCE as an effective, all-inclusive platform where the facilitation of diplomatic efforts and cooperation, participating states can rebuild basic trust and confidence, de-escalate long-standing hostilities, enhance sustainable peace, comprehensive security and democracy, and revitalize shared values and principles of the OSCE region. And so my first question to the three panelists, and some of you have already touched on this a little bit, are these objectives of the OSCE still valid, relevant in light of the armed conflict in Ukraine? Can the OSCE play a role in helping restore peace, assist with conflict resolution and the role of law? So I'll go to General Nolan first and then to Uta. General Nolan. You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Aline. Okay, the decision of the Russian government to invade Ukraine violates all the fundamental principles of international law and all the norms of the OSCE dating back to the Helsinki Decalogue. Unquestionably, the war in the Donbass and the war in Ukraine are considerably weakened the OSCE. The failure of the special monitoring mission and the lack of visibility and silence of the OSCE during this conflict illustrates this weakening and pose serious problems of legitimacy for this organization. As a result, many experts believe that the OSCE no longer has, and especially will no longer have, a role to play in a possible reconstruction of a European security architecture. I do not share this opinion. First of all, because the very essence of the OSCE's role is to make dialogue possible, even among enemies, to mitigate instability. This is what we need most at the moment. It remains, therefore, OSCE, an organization whose entire purpose remains vital to the preservation of a structured security in Europe. In this perspective, the first important point I would like to make is that Russia, despite its aggressions, remains a participating state of the OSCE and must remain so. Even if the hope of bringing the current president of Russia to the negotiating table remains low for the moment, Russia will always be indispensable for the construction of European security. One could say, paraphrasing General de Gaulle, who said in the 60s, Russia will drink communism like blotting paper drinks ink. One could say that Russia will drink Putinism like blotting paper drinks ink. In this context, the OSCE would have a natural and important role to play to monitor a potential ceasefire or peace agreement in Ukraine and support reconstruction. In the immediate future, the OSCE could relaunch the Moscow mechanism created at the instigation of Russia at the Moscow Conference on the Human Dimension in 1991, I quote, to facilitate resolution of a particular question or problem related to human dimension. Already, the OSCE has been at the origin of a report on violation of international humanitarian and human rights law, war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict. This report by 3 independent experts investigating as much as possible in both belligerents, beyond its role to dismantle disinformation and do justice to the victims, will have served to strengthen the expertise and role of the International Criminal Court. Such initiative under the Moscow mechanism could serve to strengthen the role and visibility of the OSCE in the current situation. However, with Russia's participation reaffirmed, it is clear that in its current state, the OSCE, as currently structured, cannot be a part of rebuilding the European security architecture. This will require a reform of its modus operandi, and in particular, a re-evaluation of the consensus rule. Finally, and most importantly, the OSCE must affirm its role in preserving multilateralism by refusing the establishment of a new Westphalian world order, where a small set of great powers, each surrounded by client states, compete for power and influence and impose their decisions on their clients. It is vital to maintain such multilateral fora, the only ones capable of building cooperative security, which is history, its experience, and the participation of countries from the Euro-Atlantic and Euro-Asian areas, including many non-aligned states. The OSCE must assume its role of prevention and conflict management, but to face this existential crisis and to rebuild European security, an innovative thinking will be required. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General Roland. I now pass over to Uta to respond to this question.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. This was a sentence of from the first committee's resolution, and I think this sentence is very true. And at the same time, it's a hope and a task for all people engaged within the OSCE, parliamentarians and government. They are all responsible to work to preserve and promote the core values of the organization for the benefit and prosperity of its participating states and their peoples. And that's a sentence from a press release, a recent declaration of the Troika, which means Sweden, Poland, and Macedonian officials, and of the General Secretary of the OSCE. And I think the strength of the OSCE is that this is 55 states, and Christine mentioned it, 55 states from different angles and from different environments. They come together, the governments, they come together with the head of states and the ambassadors quite frequently. They discuss together all the problems that maybe at the time be on the table. They discuss and speak and listen to each other like the parliamentarians will do, and they quarrel, they disagree, they may shout at each other, but in between they eat and drink and laugh and maybe joke and gossip a little. And so I think this is very important that they talk about the problems that are actually there for everyone. One instance, one example is a conference that recently end of May took place in Vienna. It was a conference with the Mediterranean partners for cooperation, and they discussed the issues of climate-related issues and their implication for prosperity, security, and stability. And the conference discussed food insecurity and inflation and poverty and social instability and the consequences on all the countries. And I think the Mediterranean countries, they know very well that there is an impact of the war on Ukraine, and the OSCE can discuss these consequences. I think it is very true that they need new structures, maybe, and a new system to put away with all the inhibitions for a very good performance that it can make. But on the other hand, we mentioned what went wrong with the Minsk government, with the Minsk agreement in the first panel. We can take consequences out of these deficiencies, but it is really important that we don't let it break up. I mean, it's weakened, like Bernard Nolan said. Of course it is. But I think there's a renewed interest, at least in a very big portion of the countries there, within the OSCE, because every government, every parliamentarian, and every people in the region, they feel the consequences of what has been going wrong. And the interest must be to save mankind from the evil consequences. And they can be very evil if we let them go.
Thank you very much, Uta. I'll pass on to Jackie now to respond to this, the role the OSCE could play.
Okay, so, I'm not an expert on the OSCE, and it's not a panacea, but I want to point out a couple of its positive attributes to people who may not be aware. First of all, it is expressly not a military alliance. That's really important to understand. Secondly, its membership includes the United States and its NATO allies, and Russia and the Ukraine. So therefore, its very existence suggests the possibility of a channel for dialogue and must be maintained and nurtured in that regard. I think it was Uta who mentioned earlier that there was an OSCE initiative to facilitate communication between Ukrainian and Russian members of parliament. That kind of thing could be very, very important. Second thing that strikes me is that when Andrea Zuma described what happened with the Minsk agreements and the lack of resources, Christine Mutzenen then picked up on that and said the OSCE has a very small budget and they're always fighting for funding. Well, I think that increasing the funding for the OSCE is something that needs to happen, providing it with more resources so that it can be more effective. And one of the barriers I see to that is that perhaps in the United States, nobody knows about the OSCE. And I mean that almost literally. I think if you did a poll of the general population, you would find 1%. And if you did a poll of the whatever remnants of the peace movement, you'd find 2%. So that's just something that we need to be aware of and figure out how to counter that. And finally, I would say that, like the United Nations, the OSCE is coming up short on issues of peace and ending wars and redefining security. On the other hand, they are having success in other areas, agriculture, reproductive rights, and so on and so forth. And so we need to build on those areas where there has been success and try to bring them more into the peace and what they call peace and security, the peace and ending wars and redefining security end of things.
Thank you very much, Jackie. I'd like to actually, before moving back to the nuclear weapons issue, to just follow up a little bit on the comments that all the three panelists have just made now, but also pick up from some from the previous panel, which is everyone's on the panels has said there could be a role for the OSCE. It provides a very important framework for addressing these, provides lots of possibilities, but one of the problems is there isn't enough financial support or political capital or knowledge about it. Three key things which need to be improved. So question to the panelists is, how can we improve on that? What are ways that we can elevate political capital, political attention and use of the OSCE? How can we encourage governments to finance it more? You know, and the OSCE budget is a minuscule proportion of what European countries are putting into NATO. Or what other governments are putting into militaries. How can we increase that? And thirdly, how can we educate public and engage public and parliamentarians more so that they know more about it, engage and take up these opportunities? So maybe I'll go in the reverse order this time. Jackie, do you have some ideas about how can you increase this in the United States?
That's a really tough question, Alan. I can start talking about it more in my contacts. I'd like to know more. For example, maybe we can take advantage of this upcoming parliamentary assembly to report back on if any Americans, members of parliament, are there. I do see that there is a resolution on Ukraine co-sponsored by an American senator. But if we can get information about U.S. participation in the OSCE, which we can contextualize within the purpose and context of the OSCE, we might be able to start doing some education.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. I know also something that's big in the United States is model UNs. Maybe we can encourage them to do a model OSCE meeting, get it into the minds of young people. So Uta, do you have some ideas on these three aspects of elevating?
I have a lot of ideas. I remember that in my days at the Bundestag, I was a delegate almost all the time of my time in the Bundestag to the OSCE, and it was very important to me. And in the beginning, maybe for a couple of years, maybe 5 years, we had a working group on the OSCE, which was a group for the delegates to work on the issues. And sometimes later they just skipped it. I don't know why. Normally you would expect the delegates to report to their committees, like the Foreign Affairs Committee, for instance, or even the Defense Committee, but probably maybe it's a Development Committee too, or at least give a report and have a discussion in your committee. And it seldom, really seldom happened. And I must criticize some of the parliamentarians I met in our delegation and in other delegations. Some of them thought this was kind of a nice holiday with some political discussions in between. So we really must make parliamentarians aware, of course, the public aware. And it's true, I think even in Germany, not everybody knows what the OSCE does and what it really is. Of course, if the relevance of such an institution can be really sharpened in the minds of the government, they will be willing to contribute more money. But my experience is that every time the discussion for the budget was the most really complicated thing, and we sometimes told our government, or at least I did, they spend more money on the OSCE because they could give some additional funding to it, and not only the 10% or what it is for Germany of the whole budget. And the second thing happening every year, and I think it's going to happen again if one of the countries doesn't agree with the budget. They don't have a budget, and it can't work. So then their existence is really in danger, and next time they will have to vote on a new Secretary General, maybe the existing one, which is a very good one. She's a woman. She is has served in the European Union for a long time and negotiated a difficult agreement. She's very, very good. Helga Schmidt is her name. She could be re-elected, but if nobody is willing, or one country or two are not willing to re-elect her, they don't have a Secretary General. And last time, because she, before she was being elected for her first time, it took, I think, about half a year with a vacancy of the office of the General Secretary. And last but least, there may be a danger that Russia really takes these instruments, not agreeing with the budget, or maybe, as I heard, that they threatened to leave the OSCE. I don't know whether this is a true danger, but I think right now is a time that all the governments who want to save the existence of the OSCE really unite and try to do their best to avoid such a damage.
Thank you very much, Uta. And just before I turn to General Nolan to address this question, I just note that in the chat we had a comment from Margaret Keener-Nellen, a former parliamentarian from Switzerland who was the head of the Swiss delegation to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly for some time. Thank you very much, Margareta, for putting in here. And in the chat she writes that there is an OSCE Parliamentary Assembly has appointed a special rep for engaging civil society. And I'll put the link to that page so that you can go on there and you can indicate your interest in engaging with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and they hold consultations that are open for civil society. So that link is in there, and thank you very much, Ms. Keenan-Allen, for making that observation there. So General Nolan, do you have also some ideas about how to elevate the political attention, finance, and knowledge about the OSCE and its importance?
Yes, it's a difficult question, Alan, because as Jackie said, and also Uta, okay, the knowledge about OSCE is very, very weak. Not only in the US, but also in Europe, and especially in France, where, you know, very few people know something about OSCE. It's a big problem. But I say again that OSCE is the only one remaining organization, multilateral organization, international organization, where all the many countries about which are interested in European security architecture are represented, and especially we have still Russian participation and West participation. It could be, you know, an arena to begin discussion, informal discussion. It's very important for that, OSCE, and it depends of the governments, and especially European Western government, to relaunch the role of OSCE, to give once again, not only with a budget, a more important budget, but also with a political role, to give a political role to OSCE to continue this discussion. Because maybe you remember the role of OSCE during the Cold War. You remember the role of OSCE during with the Helsinki Act, Helsinki Decalogue. You remember the basket 1, the basket 3, and many things like that. And it has been at the time. You remember it was Brezhnev, Russian leader at that time, and with the basket tree and the OSCE had a role in the change of during the Cold War, in the change between Russia and inside Russia, certainly. It's very important to take into the mind this role, this possible role for the OSCE, and the role could be coming from the NGOs, but it depends on the government. And it's very important that in that situation, in the situation of the conflict in Ukraine, it's very important to get active such canal, because we have no more possibility to get discussion with Russia in this moment, except this OSCE and also some bilateral discussion. But but I repeat, it depends of the government. It depends of the, and also I believe that OSCE, because the OSCE is silent for the moment, and also it has to come from the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE to take initiative to relaunch. I have said that we can relaunch the Moscow mechanism, something like that, because it's a way to do the role of OSCE really emerging now, because it's very important, and we need this organization for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to swing back to the nuclear weapons issue, and we've talked a little bit in the first panel on nuclear risk reduction, no first use, keeping dialogue open with Russia on strategic stability dialogue, some of those issues. Something that's come up more, I think, in this panel has been looking at the Non-proliferation Treaty Review Conference, and which is coming up in August for 4 weeks. And so the question here is, and this is one of the recommendations that is being discussed and made to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, is that the Assembly supports the idea of calling on the states parties of the Non-proliferation Treaty to commit to nuclear disarmament within a time-bound framework, no later than 2045, the 100th anniversary of the UN and the 75th anniversary of the NPT. So question coming back to the panelists now, what's the possibility of making any progress at the NPT review conference in August? Is there some possibilities that some of these issues could be taken forward? It's a 4-week process. Are there other initiatives that have been taken forward at the NPT review conference? So maybe I'll start with Jackie this time, because you mentioned this. It's included in the US Conference of Mayors statement. Can you give a little bit of an idea of what you would hope with the NPT review conference?
Okay, I'm not very hopeful about it, actually. However, I will point out, as I did about the OSCE in an analogous way, is that it's the only forum in which almost all of the countries in the world get together and discuss nuclear weapons for a month. So it is an important channel for dialogue and communication. It's also the only forum where the nuclear armed states sit with the non-nuclear armed states and discuss their divergent views on nuclear weapons. I do think that the idea of reintroducing the idea of a time-bound framework is very important, and a working group of the Abolition 2000 Global Network to Eliminate Nuclear Weapons has produced a working paper on this subject, which is referred to not by name, but the concept is referred to in the PNND recommendation to the Parliamentary Assembly, and also in the US Conference of Mayors resolution. And what we talk about is that there are a variety of possible modalities for negotiations to achieve and maintain a nuclear weapon-free world. And this could include negotiation of a comprehensive nuclear weapons convention or package of agreements, negotiation of a framework agreement, which includes the legal commitment to achieve a nuclear weapons-free world, identifies the measures and pathways required in general terms, and provides a process for agreeing in details over time, or negotiation of protocols to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons or related instruments, which nuclear armed and allied states would sign as part of a process for them to join the TPNW and build the nuclear destruction, elimination, verification, and compliance process through the TPNW, particularly its Article 4. So we point out here that the TPNW is not the only possible pathway, and we don't want to get hung up on that. We really don't care what the pathway is as long as it happens. And so we recommend to this review conference establishing an intersessional process to explore the legal, technical, and institutional measures to progressively reduce nuclear weapons stockpiles and phase out reliance on nuclear weapons, and to achieve the global prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons under strict, effective, and verifiable international control. Committing to adopt a concrete plan at the UN General Assembly Conference on Disarmament and or the 11th NPT Review Conference in 2025 to implement these measures, and committing to a time frame of no later than 2030 for the adoption of a framework package of agreements or comprehensive nuclear weapons convention, and no later than 2045 for full implementation in order to fulfill the NPT Article 6 and customary law obligation to achieve the global elimination of nuclear weapons no later than the 100th anniversary of the first use of nuclear weapons, the 75th anniversary of the NPT, and the 100th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. And most importantly, the NPT again provides an opportunity for civil society to project the extreme sense of urgency we feel about the dangers of nuclear war. And we ended this paper with a quote, a short quote from Camus. Faced with the terrifying perspectives which are opening up to humanity, we can perceive even better that peace is the only battle worth waging. It is no longer a prayer, but an order which must rise up from people to their governments, the order to choose finally between hell and reason.
Thank you very much, Jackie. I've put the link in the chat box to that working paper from the Abolition 2000 working group. And I think you gave some very good reflections on some of the proposals within that working paper. One reflection I can make is that it helps to bridge the gap that has been created between the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and those states who don't support that and say, we're not going to join it, and this is why. And you mentioned, that this provides a bridge by saying, well, here are some ways that you could work on protocols that might help then bridge and bring nuclear weapon states into the TPNW, or if not that, here's an alternative. So it's not like the continue talking past each other, but how to move forward on the issues required to reach a nuclear weapons-free world. So
I just might mention that, if there is another NPT review conference in 2025, which is only 3 years away, that this one might be sort of considered a preparatory committee meeting for that, even though it is officially a review conference. So,
yeah. Thanks, Jackie. So, Uta, did you have any comments on the NPT review conference?
Yes, of course I do. And I think the upcoming NPT review conference is extremely important in the view of the war against Ukraine. We have seen numerous threats of use of nuclear weapons by Putin, and it will be most important to strengthen the nuclear taboo. Participating states must keep in mind the 1996 opinion of the International Court of Justice. I really think that's really important to remind this. There must be a consensus to delegitimize nuclear weapons, and at least to minimize their role in doctrines and strategies. And as the US still has to, as far as I know, to publish their nuclear posture review, should be published a month ago, and not NATO by August, we'll have decided on the strategic concept. So it's important to have the signals right now to these gremia to really remind the dangers that are coming with nuclear weapons. Many actors, non-nuclear weapon states, for instance, and governments have invested a great deal to make the review conference a success, or at least to avoid a disaster after the 2015 outcome. So risk reduction is vital, and a lot of actors call for it, and it's really important. It was mentioned before with the talks between US and Russia on stability talks. The alerting sounds like a very good idea there, and it would be helpful if the nuclear weapon states could agree on a no first use, for instance, by remembering their own sentence, nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. One important goal will be to safeguard the last existing nuclear reduction treaty, New START, and this will be important vis-à-vis the modernization that is going on in all nuclear weapon states. And we have to safeguard all international treaty regimes on weapons of mass destruction, like the Chemical Weapons Convention, Biological Weapons Convention. I say this because it's not a nuclear issue, but chemical and biological, but Russia has hinted to leaving the Chemical Weapons Convention, which would be a disaster, I think. And I think it's important that the Iran deal should be rescued, so to say. And Iran already threatens, as far as I heard, to leave the NPT in the context of these negotiations there. So it's really a danger worldwide. And the danger of proliferation is rising too. For instance, in North Korea, they have a poll, and a big portion of the population is in favor of acquiring themselves nuclear weapons, and there are political parties there who are in favor of that too. And what happens when the Iran deal doesn't succeed with Saudi Arabia or Egypt, and also Turkey has hinted that they would be not against nuclear weapons in their own possession. So it's really a terrible issue and important to discuss at this review conference. And just a few days ago, Putin offered Iskander systems to Lukashenko, which are nuclear capable. What does that mean? What does that mean? Does it mean Lukashenko will be the next, or Belarus will be the next nuclear state, or what? So not to speak of all the other non-official nuclear states, which should be mentioned in this conference too. So I think at least one goal of this conference should be to reach agreement on a moratorium on the modernization and of nuclear weapons, and on the development of new nuclear weapon designs that could hopefully pave the way for new disarmament initiatives in the future. But if nothing else really succeeds, besides the unfinished business still from the beginning of the conferences in 1995, the CTBT and the FMCT, they are still not finalized. But besides that, there are new really important issues that should be discussed at this conference, and successful, I hope.
Thank you very much, Uta. I now pass on to General Nolan. Do you have any comments on the upcoming NPT review conference?
Yes, Aline, very briefly. Okay, to answer to your question directly, for me, I am very pessimistic about the possibility of a successful outcome of this 10th NPT REFCON. Even more, I am very pessimistic about the future of the NPT. After the semi-failure of the 2015 conference, another failure of this conference would be a fatal blow to this organization. Already, the new arms race of the nuclear states, both quantitative and qualitative, coupled with technological developments blurring in particular the distinction between nuclear and conventional weapon system, has created an environment favorable to the use of nuclear weapons and tends to substitute doctrine of deterrence with doctrines of persuasion involving offensive use. But the invasion of Ukraine created the worst political environment for this next REFCON. The P5 declaration of January 2022 that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought has now been called into question due to Russia's nuclear threats. The last one being to announce, as Jutta said just before, to announce the delivery of possible nuclear missiles to Belarus. Not only is there now and more than ever, discord within the P5, but its subsequent statement will no longer credible. Added to this is the dissension between Western states over the AUKUS Pact. All this makes it seems unlikely, if not impossible, to reach an agreement in such an environment. All that can be hoped for is that within the P5, the nuclear armed states will manage to restore a certain degree of trust and dialogue among themselves. We can also hope that the non-nuclear countries will take a leap of faith in the ban treaty and make themselves better heard by the nuclear countries within the NPT. In particular, by demanding new negative security assurances. Ultimately, it is the very existence of the NPT that is in question, in my opinion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. We're coming up to the last round. And again, apologize to those people whose questions aren't able to be answered. There are so many questions, and this is wonderful because it means there's a lot of people thinking about these issues and asking questions. Thank you also to people who've been posting comments and links in the chat box. Of course, the chat box will be saved. And this will be available to everyone who's participated or registered for this event. We will be making a Zoom recording of both the video and the chat box, so that will be available a couple of days after the event. The video recording itself of the event has been streamed on Facebook, so that'll be available immediately afterwards, but that doesn't include the chat box. So that's just a little bit saying we are noticing the comments and the questions, even though we can't answer all of them. It's going to go now to like a final round to the panelists, and that is, I think some of the questions that have been coming up is, can we broaden the support for these issues of common security and for nuclear disarmament by engaging additional actors? You know, so far we've been talking mostly about parliamentarians, governments, and just randomly about civil society, but are there actors that we can bring in, and not just actors, are there connections that we can make that can help to increase the possibility? I think Jackie sort of touched on it a little bit, but there could be, I think, a little bit more that could be said about how to build cooperation, maybe with those who are working in other areas, other parts of the Sustainable Development Goals, other of the human security areas that might be able to shift some of the thinking or shift some of the politics. So the last round, you know, how can we increase, you know, I said the greater public engagement through engaging different actors or making connections with issues. Shall I start with Jackie?
Okay. All right, I mentioned the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival at the very end of my opening remarks. And I'm putting a lot of my efforts and my hope into that vehicle in the United States. So let me tell you what it is, and I'll explain why. Before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King had identified the triple evils of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism as three issues that could not be separated. And he was calling for a revolution of values. And he launched a Poor People's Campaign to center on the needs of poor people. The Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, was relaunched in 2018, picking up on King's work and adding two more pillars. So the Poor People's Campaign addresses systemic racism, systemic poverty, environmental devastation, militarism in the military budget, and the distorted moral narrative of Christian nationalism. It identifies those as 5 interlocking injustices that are inseparable and that can only be addressed as a moral fusion campaign. And that is a campaign that is based on a revolution of values. And I think in the United States, I cannot speak for outside the United States, that this provides the most promising counterweight to all of the rising authoritarianism that we're experiencing, the rising racism, the misogyny, all of the injustices we're facing. And the Poor People's Campaign has exposed through their own studies that 140 people in the United States, 140 million people in the United States lived in poverty or one paycheck away from financial ruin before the pandemic. So it's exposed, that's like over 40% of the population. So it has exposed this reality. And sometimes you have to set aside what your focal issue and stand with people working on other issues to establish the trust and the solidarity that will bring them into your sphere. And the Poor People's Campaign has taken on militarism. It calls for the elimination of nuclear weapons specifically in its moral budget. It calls for cutting the military budget by 50%. It calls for closing 60% of US foreign military bases. And on last Saturday, on June 18th, there was a Poor People's Mass Assembly in Washington, DC, where tens of thousands of people from all over the country and from all walks of life came together in this moral fusion campaign. So another way of saying this would be to say, instead of focusing on organizing around issues, I think we need to come together around common values. That doesn't mean we give up our issue focuses and our expertise, but it means we know who to rely on in other areas and when to come together so that we're all together building the mass movement that we're going to need to create the political change we need in the United States and across the world.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm going to go to Uta and General Nolan next, and then I'm going to finish up by inviting Wanda to come back on and giving a comment on this, because Wanda is the co-convener of Youth Fusion and has been working very much with Youth Fusion on building intergenerational dialogue on these issues and building cooperation between the climate and nuclear movements. So that might be nice to finish off with Wanda's comments on that. So yeah, Wanda is still here with us. Thank you. So Uta, you first, then Bernard, and then we'll finish up with Wanda.
There's a strange phenomenon that right now, when we have a war in our neighborhood, the peace movement in Germany, for instance, is totally split. So it is very, or it's almost impossible to work together. Although both sides, the one supporting Ukraine with weapons and the other pleading for anything instead of weapons like diplomacy and so forth. They mean the same thing. They want to end the war, but they can't make actions together. That's a fact. So that applies to what you said about Wanda, what she's going to refer to. We have to unite with other movements that are working for common human security, which is climate change, and it's a strong movement. there are difficulties, of course, because they won't compromise, for instance, on practical steps in policy, what governments are doing. But still, we must understand we have to unite, and we have to unite with all these NGOs and activists who are working for development in the world, to implement, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is a sentence that Willy Brandt said. He said, peace and development, they belong to each other. You don't get peace without development, and you don't get development without peace. So to fight hunger in the world, to fight pandemic in the world, you need common security, and you need solidarity between the different groups. And I think if we really could convince the separate fighters for climate change, the fighters for the implementation of the SDGs and better development policies, for implementation of all the values that we really all share for the good for people, for the well-being and the prosperity of people, without a success in, I have a picture like drawing on the same rope, you know, in the same direction, if you can. Then we really should try to do that. And I think Wanda as a person, she does it with their your actions and your engagement.
Thank you, Uta. General Nolan, you have any comments to add?
Yes, you know, it's a very interesting question, a very important question that Jackie and Uta has raised, because you know, we are living in a transition period, a period between the world of tomorrow, where the real challenges, security challenges, are the climate, the pandemic, and so on, the environment, and the world, the yesterday world, where where there are nationalism, you know, there is confrontation between states and the old order, Westphalian order. And we are, how I can say that, because drive into a corner between these two worlds, the world of tomorrow and the world of yesterday. But unfortunately, okay, the immediate threat is the Russian threat. We can say that like that, huh? But the conflict in Ukraine and this threat needs militarism responses. And and we have, you know, between these two problems, these two questions, and it's sure that the world of tomorrow is the question of the world of tomorrow is the question of human security, the question of climate, and you know, among these challenges, the security challenges, the nuclear challenges is not only, maybe not only the most important, but it's the most immediate. The problem is the nuclear threat, which is very important now, very huge now, because you know, everybody now believes that with the Ukraine conflict, that nuclear weapon, the nuclear systems would be the response to the nuclear threat from, you know, with the deterrence, you know, everybody knows the deterrence concept. But the problem is the conflict in Ukraine shows the absurdity of nuclear weapons, because with deterrence, everybody and every responsible politician, responsible decision maker, he believes that deterrence gives you peace and shows the impossibility of the war. In fact, the Ukraine conflict shows that the nuclear war is possible, that we are on the edge of a nuclear war. It's completely absurd, that situation. And moreover, to resist to the blackmail, nuclear blackmail from Putin, okay, the democracy, the nuclear state, nuclear states are unable to use the deterrence concept because they are because they are right, because they fear the risk of nuclear conflict. The problem is the nuclear weapons are absurd because they are as everybody knows, the humanity is in question, and also because with the democracy you can't use your weapons. It's totally situation absurd, and the climate change, the pandemic, the new security challenge needs global weapons. When you are in a situation like now in Eastern Europe, you have national response. It's a different world which is confronting now, and we are in the middle of these two worlds, and the situation is very difficult to get and to find a solution in this situation. The reality is that there is global threats. There are now global threat, and nuclear threat is the first global threat. It's the first time that humanity could destroy by itself.
Thank you very much, General. We need to be wrapping up now.
Yeah,
you've painted the framework of a transition from the world of the past to the world of tomorrow or the future, and so it's good for us to have the final comments from a voice from that'll be inhabiting the future most. Young youth will be inhabiting the future and have a lot of important interest in ensuring that we have a future. So Vanda, a few comments on the role of youth and the connecting of these issues that you have been doing in some of the various initiatives.
Thanks, Alan. This was a lovely introduction. Well, I would just like to start with a big thank you for not forgetting about the young people in this conversation in general. I was listening and I was waiting for someone to bring it up, and I didn't want it to come from me. So thank you. I think it's absolutely crucial that young people are actively involved, and by that I mean that they're not just sitting at the table, but they're actually having the dialogues and the conversations. I think a meaningful intergenerational dialogue is absolutely, without that, we're all doomed. And both sides can really learn from it. Just from personal experience, I'm involved in the OSCE Scholarship for Peace and Security, and also UNODA's Youth for Disarmament programs, and I'm meeting hundreds of young people who are working towards disarmament, and they're brilliant and so smart and so determined and so enthusiastic that I almost don't worry about the future, just from talking with these people. But I will admit that we still need the support of you, of the experts and of the people that are currently in the positions of power. And so we really do appreciate that support. I will also say that young people are very good at connecting the dots. That's one of the things that we at Youth Fusion do, highlighting how, for example, nuclear disarmament relates to the environmental issues, and how we can't talk about climate change and sort of forget about the security issues and all of that, or how we can't talk about security and be forgetting about gender equality. So yep, just thank you for all the support. There are exciting things happening, and if there are any young people in the audience, check out Youth Fusion. A little self promo here.
Thank you very much, Vanda. Can I just say, anyone in the audience, regardless of whether they're young or just young at heart, can check out Youth Fusion, because you're doing intergenerational dialogue events and also just signing on to the newsletter. You get to see so many of the wonderful initiatives that not only Youth Fusion, but others in the wider network are doing. So I put the link to Youth Fusion into the chat and encourage everybody to go on and sign up and become inspired and active in the intergenerational dialogue and in supporting youth. Once again, a thank you to the panelists from both panels. This has been a really interesting dialogue. I think, you know, we got a little bit more into sort of how to move the process forward in the second panel, a little bit more on analysis and the politics in the first panel, but there's a lot of crossover between the two. There are, again, tried to address many of the questions from the audience. There's lots more that they couldn't address, but we kept in mind. And a thank you to all the participants. We see there was a lot of sharing of thoughts and ideas in the chat. It all seemed very respectful, which is very good, with different opinions, which it's great that they come out and it's done in a good manner. So once again, thank you to everybody. We will be sending a follow-up email to everybody who has participated in this so that you can relook at the video if need be, or have other links to some of the key things that were being shared. We wish you well. We wish for peace. We wish for a better climate. We wish for nuclear disarmament and a future for us and for future generations. Thank you very much.
Big hello to Jonathan Granoff.